Good evening and welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those joining us for the first time, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Joining us today is David Satter, who is an author of 5 books and multiple articles, some of which we'll be discussing today, as well as a documentarian. He was a former Financial Times reporter, one of the first Western journalists to be kicked out of Russia by Putin in 2014. And this program was actually inspired by his 2017 Tablet magazine piece, which detailed how the United States, how Western policies have set up Putin to become a president for life and created this situation that led to the invasion in the events we are watching today. Before we get into this topic and also address a more recent article in Wall Street Journal, which addresses the penetration of Russia's information warfare empire, I'd like David, if you don't mind, give us a little bit background about the context, how you came to be in Russia, what you saw when you were there, and what caused you to be PNG'd from the country.
Well, I went to Russia for the first time when I was a graduate student, actually. It was many, many years ago. I was a graduate student at Oxford University in England, and I traveled to Russia, it was then the Soviet Union. I traveled as a tourist, but I was fascinated by the country and I tried to learn the language. And it was through a lucky break. Actually, I was appointed the Moscow correspondent of the Financial Times of London when I was still quite young. And I spent 6 years in the Soviet Union. It was a period when I couldn't go back. But then as a result of the Gorbachev reforms, in the end, I was allowed. In fact, I was told this, I was the last American journalist to be allowed back in, and paradoxically, the first to be expelled in 2013, when the situation became more repressive in Russia. And I assumed that the reason for my expulsion from what was now, of course, post-Soviet Russia was, among other things, the work that I had done on the apartment bombings, which brought Putin to power. I think that's the most sensitive question that faces Russia. And people wrote at the time that it wasn't surprising that I was expelled. It was surprising that it took so long. So that's just a short explanation. I been involved with Russia basically almost all of my adult life. And I continue to be. I've been writing a new book about Russia. In this case, it's a history of Russia after the fall of communism. So from 1991 to the present day. But insofar as Russia is now back in the news for all of the wrong reasons, I've been quite active in writing about what's going on and trying to do my best to influence the situation in a positive direction to the extent that any one person can do that.
Now, in your article, in the Tablet magazine article that I was referencing, you pointed out that event, the attacks on these buildings, was exactly the sort of turning point event that put Russia in the direction that it's continuing to pursue to this day, and that the US and other countries' policy essentially allowed that to happen. How did it come to the point that particular event that you reported on that caused you to be expelled raised so little, relatively speaking, interest in the United States, and certainly did not carry any political response?
That's a very interesting question. I've thought about that myself. Why is it that people don't pay attention to things that are truly important, and they become obsessed with things that are trivial. I mean, that's the story of America, and that's the story of America's relationship with Russia in the post-Soviet era. I mean, the apartment bombings should have been front page news. They should have been absolutely the focus of all attention. But our government made a decision not to raise the subject. And it was rather dangerous to investigate. And the Russian authorities gave an explanation for the events, which, although absurd, was nonetheless something that they could repeat. And somehow or other, under the pressure of fast-moving events, because at the same time there was a new presidential election, they were able to bury it. The Russians were able to bury the story in part because of the lack of development of Russian civil society, but also because of the lack of imagination of people in the West. Their inability to imagine that such a thing was in reality possible, that it was possible that a political leader could organize the murder of hundreds of innocent people, blowing up buildings and killing people as they slept in order to seize power. That's a leap of imagination for most Westerners. And rather than try to envisage a situation which is unfamiliar, it's easiest of all just to dismiss it, as particularly when investigating it would mean taking a risk.
Now, I'm going to push back a little bit on what you just said, because the Soviet Union, Russia's predecessor, was quite known for all sorts of provocations, false flag operations, and setups of various sorts. It was certainly not a bloodless state, an entity, and Putin was someone who was not merely a part of the nomenclature, but he was part of the intelligence system of the country, involved in operations of that sort. So when he was rising to power and he was known in the political circles, they had his background to understand his profile and the means by which he was getting to power. I could understand average Americans perhaps not having that sort of a frame for understanding his actions, but for political leaders, for insiders, for the US officials, that should not have come as no surprise. How do you explain the sudden blind spot for Putin's proclivities given his associations and his entire political history?
Well, we have to bear in mind that for 8 years, while Yeltsin was president, the policy of the United States was that Yeltsin is the symbol and embodiment of democracy, and that if the United States wants to promote democracy in Russia, all we have to do is unconditionally support Yeltsin. This, of course, relieved us of the necessity of learning what was really going on in Russia and trying to understand it. It was easy to adopt a cliche and then to stick with that cliche. And so when those buildings began to be blown up, and I'm unfortunately becoming increasingly convinced that they could not, that this whole operation could not have been undertaken without the participation of Yeltsin, and without his approval. The American officials were faced with a rather delicate situation. It turns out that this hero of democracy, to whom we had given our unconditional support, was involved in an operation that cost the lives of hundreds of people. In fact, was a terrorist act against the innocent civilian population. Well, that would not have, that's a message that many of the people who were in the American government at that time were not anxious to convey. They also, of course, had to face the possibility that if they raised the issue of the bombings, and there was time to do that before the April or the March 2000 elections, it could have a destabilizing effect in Russia. And Russia, as we know, is a country with nuclear weapons. There may have been an understandable motive that in not raising this issue and not facing this truth, because it might have been out of fear that Russia would, under those circumstances, would become destabilized. But I think that the careerist motives were also very strong. So it was probably a combination of things.
Now, Putin was Yeltsin's allegedly hand-picked successor, which in itself raises questions about, what kind of a democracy is it when an elected official chooses the person to follow him. But leaving that particular point about the democratic process aside, let's talk about the values.
Well, I'd like to just interject here that Yeltsin, on September 8th, he had a telephone call with Bill Clinton, and he said that I want to tell you that the next president is going to be Vladimir Putin. He's a good man. You'll be able to work with him. You should give him your support. Well, at that time, Yeltsin's popularity rating was 2%, and so was Putin's. So it's a question of how could he be so sure that that he was in a position to dictate or to determine who was going to be the next president. And then on September 9th, the next day, the building on Guryanova Street was blown up in the middle of the night. And later after Yeltsin was no longer president and Putin was president and had, of course, pardoned Yeltsin for any crimes he committed while he was president, Yeltsin, who was to some extent still concerned about his reputation, said that my biggest mistake was my choice of a successor. But even those words, even the use of that phrase is very indicative. My choice of a successor. In a democratic country, he's not in a position to choose his successor. It's the people who supposedly choose the successor. So that also indicates that he was, in fact, involved, as hard as it is to accept, in the terrorist act that brought Putin to power.
To the West, Yeltsin was presented as a hapless, kindly alcoholic who was not taken very seriously, particularly the last couple of years of his tenure. How accurate was this image of him as being largely uninvolved in politics and basically a pawn, a dupe of security services who were the ones who essentially helped Putin get to power?
Well, he was very sick. He was very sick. He had a number of heart attacks. I mean, he barely got through the election in 1996. They had to literally prop him up. His daughter, Tanya Dyachenko, became all powerful because she was the one who had a direct line to him. But the answer is that we can't be 100% sure. But he was the head of state, and various testimony that has come out in subsequent years says that he was still in control of major decisions. Now, why somebody who did not control the government in the country or was not fully in control should have remained as president, that's of course a serious question.
Now, what you are saying right now suggests that Yeltsin not only was a part of the process that empowered Putin's proclivities, but that he himself was very much part of the same system, contrary to the processes that appear to be democratic for the Western viewership. He was somebody with roots in the Soviet system, in the Soviet Union. Now that raises a question whether in fact your article goes far enough in history about US policy on Russia, in terms of where it has allowed things to deteriorate to the degree we're seeing today. What if the correct question is US policy has consistently been completely wrong on Russia from the beginning, from the fall of the Soviet Union, from the end of the Soviet Union until today. Let's take Gorbachev, who is lionized as a hero in the West, but who has been responsible for exactly the same sort of ethnic-based provocations we have seen Putin conduct around the former Soviet countries. We have seen what happened in Azerbaijan, for instance, just as an example. How is it that the West was able to ignore all these atrocities and create this image of a democrat who was bringing down a horrible system and liberating all the countries when it was in fact not really the case?
Well, the whole subject of Gorbachev, that's a separate issue. The country was different, the situation was different, and of course the personalities of the leaders were different. I don't know, and if we get into the subject of Gorbachev, we have to. I mean, it is true that there were bloody provocations during the period that Gorbachev was the Soviet leader, but he didn't engage in the kind of, he didn't launch massive unnecessary wars, and he didn't stage terrorist acts in order to stay in power. The incidents that took place were situations that have to this day not been fully investigated and still need to be, about what, who gave what orders and what were the circumstances. But there was a general tendency under Gorbachev to try to avoid bloodshed. I mean, certainly under conditions in which a great empire was falling apart, that was not 100% successful. But I don't think it's in the same category with what has taken place under Yeltsin, for example, with tanks shelling the parliament, the elimination of the parliament and by force, the use of a provocation to justify it, the war undertaken against Chechnya, supposedly because Yeltsin needed a short victorious war to boost his ratings. And of course now this unprovoked and horrific attack on Ukraine. So I think that really, in historical perspective, Gorbachev actually, and it's certainly compared with both Yeltsin and Putin, I mean, Gorbachev was at least slightly better in that, there was a tendency under Gorbachev to avoid repression and avoid mass crimes. I mean, not entirely successful, but that tendency existed. And we don't see, I mean, in the case of both Yeltsin and Putin, they clearly don't care how many people they kill.
The reason why I brought up was Gorbachev was to show the continuity of Western policy in idealizing.
Oh, and idealizing uninformed idealization of Russian or Soviet leaders. I mean, that's definitely, that's definitely the case. And And that's one of the reasons why we have the war that we have now in Ukraine, because this was a preventable war. Many things were preventable. For example, just take the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner MH17. I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal about that, and I said that all Russian aircraft should be denied landing rights. And now, of course, it's happened. But if it had happened then, it would have made a difference.
Now, we've seen that not only has the West idealized Russian leaders and the system itself, but they have allowed the Soviet system to kind of transform itself into this crony capitalist kleptocracy without ever pushing for any real reforms. And we are seeing what you're suggesting, a continuity of terrorist policies from Yeltsin to Putin. Nevertheless, Yeltsin enjoyed immense popularity in the West. He was lauded as a friend by Bill Clinton. And as for Putin, we have seen him through multiple US administrations, and all of them, whether Republican or Democrat, have tried to find something good about Putin and to try to work with him anew, as if their predecessors have not already tried and failed. How do you explain that strange conundrum? What makes Putin so special compared to other dictators around the world?
Well, for one thing, he's in control of a country which has nuclear weapons and a very powerful army, or what we thought was a powerful army. Maybe it's not as powerful as we thought it was. It's certainly a big army. And there was always the desire that we could somehow win Russia over and make the Russians behave normally. And there was little appetite, I must say, for understanding Russia or learning about Russia. And learning about Russia is not that easy. It requires the ability to believe the unbelievable. Once you accept the idea that the Russian leaders really are as degraded as they appear to be, that they are capable of committing terrorist acts against their own people or launching invasions that are completely unjustified and unprovoked, or shooting down a civilian airliner for their own not very admirable reasons. Once you accept that all that is possible, then things begin to make sense. But there's a psychological barrier to doing that. And our officials in the U.S. are people who are characterized by their ability, in many cases, sadly, to make successful careers, not necessarily deep intellect or a commitment or moral commitment. I mean, there are exceptions. There are a variety of people in those posts, but the drive to make policy on the basis of cliches, when those cliches can benefit someone's career, are just, I mean, that it is just very powerful. I mean, Boris Nemtsov and I, just before the initiation, just after rather, Barack Obama became president, and they initiated what they called the reset policy. Boris Nemtsov and I spoke to a guy who was going to be very important in the formation of that policy. And we talked to him for a long time and told him this is a mistake, that this is not a partner for the West, that the policy should be a policy of deterrence and nothing else. But of course, first of all, Barack Obama, with practically zero knowledge of Russia, took it upon himself to correct U.S.-Russian relations, which he said were not the fault of Putin or presumed were not the fault of Putin, but the fault of George W. Bush. In fact, Obama came into office with pretty much that view of the world, that there weren't real problems in the world. It's just and there weren't evil people. We had a bad president. He messed everything up, and all we had to do was undo the mess that he had created, and everything would be fine. It's very simple-minded, but it's also the way in which politics in the U.S. works. And and now with the end of the Cold War, this fixation on our internal problems and our tendency to think in cliches has become greatly magnified.
Now, when you mentioned Obama's tendency to blame everything on his predecessor, that's not new with the US presidents in general or any politicians, but what is worth noting is that it does deny independent agency to other countries and their leaderships. There is this tendency to blame the US for whatever goes wrong, and that's not to say that US policy is perfect and should not be examined, but nevertheless, it's also worth noting that countries have their own internal dynamics as their leaders, regardless of what US does or does not do. And Putin had a career that preceded George W. Bush, and his trajectory should have been examined to predict his potential course of action, independently of what Bush took it upon himself while he was in office.
It's also important to bear in mind that Putin was under investigation. There were 2 active criminal cases against Putin when he was appointed prime minister, and then they were suppressed on the grounds that we can't have criminal cases against a sitting prime minister. But that didn't stop Yeltsin. Apparently, he felt that anybody he might choose either did have or could have a criminal case against them. And in any case, his criteria for the next president were somewhat different. I mean, he wanted someone who would protect him and protect the members of his family.
We are looking at somebody who used his skills, his leverage, his network of intelligence and security associates to enrich himself. And essentially, this is a very corrupt individual. He's not just a security-minded autocrat, but he is personally corrupt and personally concerned about his immediate family members, cronies, and so forth, and not he's not so ideological that he leaves this personal enrichment behind. And that, I think, I think this was greatly underestimated, but by many Western analysts who try to
we don't know what the motivations are for the, as far as Putin's wealth, and who holds it in whose name, and it may well be that in a kleptocratic regime he has to be seen to be the #1 kleptocrat. But I think that the wealth is probably not the main thing in the case of Putin. I think it's his principal concern is power, and to make sure he never loses it, and that there's no serious challenger.
Now, that brings us to the point of his elimination of opposition by any means possible, from exile to physical liquidation, as we have seen in many cases, some successful, others less so, and not all of them were political opposition. Journalists who threatened to expose his various nefarious activities in Chechnya and elsewhere, they all suffered mysterious deaths and attempts at their lives, and all of that. Now, you earlier stated that the terrorist attack against his own people that was staged, that people found that unfathomable. But elimination of political opposition and critics is nothing new. It's a typical a thuggish authoritarian method of ensuring um, continuation of power. Why was Putin not stopped under each in all of these incidents? Why was the reaction of the West mostly muted?
Well, I mean, in every case, they gave an absurd explanation, and the West just assimilated their explanation. In some cases, repeated it, and just moved on. It's important to take, for example, the reset policy. That policy was initiated after the murder of Alexander Litvinenko with a nuclear isotope in London, and the shooting of Anna Politkovskaya. Anna was Russia's leading investigative journalist. So clearly, we weren't too concerned about those crimes. It's not just Barack Obama, but George Bush. Nothing much was made of it, and the reaction was so muted that when Obama became president, this was never brought up as a reason not to have a reset policy.
That raises yet another question. US has significant intelligence gathering capabilities, multiple intelligence agencies, perfectly capable of understanding, gathering information about the motives, the reality of leaders and their immediate surroundings in foreign countries. It's almost as if the last several administrations were operating based on newspaper articles rather than actionable intelligence from people on the ground who are privy to what is going on. How do you explain this strange phenomenon when all of that information gathering seems to be not producing any policy that's based in reality?
Well, for one thing, that information, you have to want the information. You have to be concerned. You have to see. There has to be oftentimes a political reason why you want to learn the truth. In this situation, the politics dictated in the opposite direction. They created a situation in which it just was not advantageous to know the truth. It's much better for a president to point out his good relations with Russia, the fact that there are no conflicts, than to become embroiled in a conflict that nobody is going to understand in the US, or it's going to take time and effort in order to explain it to people, even if that's the proper thing to do. If any American president, for example, who let's take the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner. Here you had a Russian anti-aircraft battery that was crossed the border into occupied Ukrainian territory, was situated under one of the most heavily traveled air corridors in the world, fired a single shot, and then left the area and crossed back into Russia. That battery had a Russian crew, and a passenger plane is unmistakable for the operator of such a sophisticated piece of equipment. But yet we accepted Russian disinformation even when it was internally contradictory, and we didn't make an effort really to get at the truth. Well, let's say that we had. Now that happened. The shootdown took place while Obama was president. He would have had to devote time and attention to that. He would have had to create a crisis by, for example, closing down Russian air travel to the United States and trying to get other countries to do the same. He would have had to have identified this as something that was important and a meaningful threat to world peace. Of course, if he had thought about it, he would have come to that conclusion, because this was the murder of 300 air passengers, willfully shot down for no reason except to heighten tensions over the war in Ukraine. But it's much easier just to accept their various explanations in this and other crises, and just move on, let it go. Hope that the situation between the United States and Russia will not get worse.
Unfortunately, this pattern of ignoring real crises when they're not suitable to political agendas and creating them or focusing on some of the others has created an international perception of the US as a country that is not fully committed to its own self-proclaimed policies of focus on democracy, human rights, liberty, and so forth, because US is seen as choosing regime.
I mean, it's indicative. I mean, when we had the Trump-Russia collusion hoax, the press coverage was overwhelming, including a literal torrent of false stories and pseudo experts. But when it came to investigating something that was really important, like the shooting down of MH17, the apartment bombings, the murders of political opponents, and many other things, we didn't have time for that. So that's a good example of the way in which the domestic political priorities in the US determine the way events are covered and the way in which we understand the world.
It's interesting to me that some of the leading Russian opposition members, some of whom also had survived attempts on their lives, have settled in the US, but they don't appear to be consulted either on high-level political level or in the Western media with respect to their insights as to this situation. Had their voices been heard more often, perhaps this entire predicament have not come as a surprise to so many people, which raises again a question. Why is it that in the midst of a crisis with Russia, Russian experts, people who've actually lived there, are not being brought to the front? Why are we hearing from assorted individuals engaging in very simplistic analysis? Well, if we escalate, then we'll get a nuclear bomb and other such, statements that are hard to take seriously.
Well, the people people think in terms of certain standard categories. So, for example, a television network or even a newspaper, when they need someone to comment, they look for an expert. And who is an expert? An expert is someone who dealt with Russia in the government. They don't have the wherewithal to investigate that person's real level of expertise. They don't read their books. They don't try to understand, or their articles, if they in most cases they don't write books, and they may not even write articles. But if they held a position, they can say on television or anywhere else that this person was the advisor on Russian affairs to such and such an administration. Now, and that's about as far as it goes. I mean, the coverage is not serious, and it doesn't, in reality, it doesn't aspire to be serious. And it's very much motivated by the internal political agenda in the US. I mean, when the Steele dossier appeared, and we're talking now about the accusations against former President Trump, that transfixed Washington, because it had a connection to the presidential race. So whether you loved Trump or hated him, you were going to be fixated on this phony document. But it's not but there aren't the same rewards if it comes to investigating for example, the apartment building bombings. Even if it weren't a question of a lot of risk, which most of our heroes are not willing to take, it's also that there's no reinforcement for it. The organizations aren't seeking it. The higher ups don't understand it. Getting into something like that would require a lot of initiative and the capacity to explain a complex situation in another culture, which your coworkers really don't understand and don't want to understand.
And that brings us to the question that will lead us to the next topic, kind of bridge this part of it to the next step, so to speak, which is the military, the alleged military strength of Russia, which has collapsed in front of that image has collapsed in front of our eyes during the Ukraine invasion. Again, that leads me to raise a natural question. I understand why with political topics such as Putin and his proclivities, it may not have been politically expedient to give to voice all the information that was being gathered in order to avoid political crisis. But such things as military strengths and vulnerabilities of an adversarial states, the evaluation of those should have been far more accurate. What happened?
Well, I'm not sure they should have been. I mean, I don't know how you judge the strength of an army until it goes into battle. I mean, of course, I'm not sure how much information we would have necessarily had about the corruption and its effects. We would have had some information. I'm not a military expert, so I'm not sure why it was assumed that Russia would fight better than it did. It's also maybe a factor that the Russian teenagers and young men who are being thrown into this conflict really don't want to be there, and they don't understand why they're fighting, and they weren't even told in advance that they would be fighting. And the Ukrainians are quite prepared to defend their country. Under these circumstances, any military would collapse, because there's you can't measure morale, you can't measure commitment, you can't measure the readiness to take risks and to fight until victory. If those things don't exist, no matter how powerful the army is, it's going to be very vulnerable.
And that brings me to the next point in the conversation, and I want to get to your Wall Street Journal article, which is information warfare. Just how much Russia was really successful in information warfare because of its techniques and methods, and how much was it really because the West chose to turn a blind eye and treat all these actions with impunity for their own reasons? Was the West really duped? Were they really misled so easily, or was it convenient for both parties in some way?
Well, I think that it was convenient for the United States not to probe too deeply. It was convenient for the United States just to accept. I don't think that Russian disinformation is particularly talented, but it didn't have to be, because the Russians were dealing with an outside world which dearly wanted them to stop being a problem, and was willing to accept any kind of indication, no matter how flimsy, that, okay, the Russians are normal, they're not out to create a crisis. And they're not going to do something that's going to inconvenience us. But life doesn't always work that way. And our lack of curiosity has has done us a lot of damage.
Now, I'm going to ask for something a little bit risky, which is a prediction. We have seen that the optics for Russian actions in Ukraine have been terrible. You see soldiers willingly engaging in war crimes, human rights abuses, their bodies literally strewing the streets. So, on the one hand, there is that myth of Russian strength and morality collapsing. But on the other hand, we are seeing Russian propaganda successfully uh, capitalize on certain Western, or particularly in the US, trends, isolationism, polarization, political infighting to recruit followers, fellow travelers, and mouthpieces. Where do you think it's all going to go? Do these things cancel each other out? What is stronger, the image of the destroyed image of the Russian morality and common sense and so forth in Ukraine, or this ability to capitalize on inherent Western vulnerabilities?
Well, I mean, right now we have a war going on, and the 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 Russian propaganda efforts are not effective in the West. They at least not, they're maybe effective in some quarters. Some foolish people may be influenced by them, but they are effective for the most part inside Russia for the Russian people, and that's what counts at the moment. Because to bring an end to this, the U.S. is going to have to win the psychological war, and that can't be done unless we can reach the Russian population, at least to some degree.
Do you think the US has the means, the skills, and the wherewithal to do that? You wrote an article suggesting how to do it. If you could tell us a little bit about your observations, and second, do you think US is in any position to apply them currently?
Well, I think that the U.S. The access of the Russian people are being isolated from the outside world. And I mean, the latest danger is that YouTube will be disconnected. They've already, the sites of foreign news organizations are already blocked. And I think that how successful this effort to isolate Russians will depend a lot on the course of the war. I mean, if the casualties are terrible, they're already terrible, and Russians become aware of it, and if the living standards in Russia really begin to collapse, we might find that there's a receptive audience in Russia for some of the things that we're saying. And even though they're closing down one by one the channels of information, people still have cell phones. They still, there's Telegram for the moment. And it's not the Soviet Union. The population can't be completely closed off, and most of all, there's word of mouth. And there's every possibility that our efforts can make a difference if we are skillful and we make a commitment in that direction.
Well, to compare this current situation to the Soviet Union, the United States in the 80s had entire institutions, entire within within public agencies devoted to countering Russian propaganda, Voice of America, and so forth. All these outfits were.
We still have that. We still have Voice of America. We still have Radio Liberty.
But how effective are they at conveying, of breaking through the
Well,
noise?
they're blocked at the moment, but you know, we are likely to have the same phenomenon that we had during the Cold War, which in which people made a real effort to get information because information was being blocked. I mean, Radio Liberty was jammed, but that didn't prevent people from listening to it and from, you know, making whatever efforts they had to make in order to get that information. I think what, you know, then under those conditions, when a site is blocked, it has some of the appeal of forbidden fruit. People become curious what it is that the authorities are trying to prevent them from seeing or hearing. So, you know, so information will continue to get through, but a lot will depend also on the ability of the United States to overcome our provincialism and overcome our fixation on trivial issues and really begin to appeal to other countries, and starting with Russia, in terms that they can understand and relate to.
It seems to me that the current attempt to appeal to Russia is being, if not mishandled, then at the very least misunderstood. The United States just canceled the Minuteman III ballistic missile tests in response to allegedly Russia's concerns about nuclear race and so forth. But in reality, it was the arms race back in the Soviet Union that helped collapse the regime in part. Why are we, instead of learning the lessons from history, we seem to be going in the opposite direction, and there seems to be no political will and no stomach for stiff resistance, and that may contribute to what you said earlier about this continuity of impunity for Putin and his heinous actions, because did Westerners really want crisis to deal with, whether on the presidential level or popular level? How do we overcome this complacency? Can we overcome this complacency at this point?
Well, the complacency began to be overcome with the invasion of Crimea, although the measures that were taken were very ineffectual, especially compared to what we're doing now. I think now, of course, there's no, even a fool would find it obvious that Russia is an aggressor state, that Russia is a menace, that Putin is in many ways a really evil political leader. I mean, but the unfortunate thing is it took us so long to come to this conclusion. And as a result, we didn't take steps that we could have taken, which might have prevented this war.
What do you think should have been those steps?
Well, we should have made public, raised our concerns about the apartment bombings in 1999, especially after FSB agents were caught putting a bomb in a building in Ryazan. We should have reacted to the murder of the hostages in the theater on Dubrovka in 2002, or in the Beslan school, 2004, or the Chechen War, the first Chechen War, and not to mention the second Chechen War. The shooting down of the airliners, the assassination of political opponents. Every time we simply just didn't react, or we took note of their reaction and moved the official Russian explanation, and then moved on. Well, yeah, that creates a certain momentum. Then, of course, we withdrew our troops from Afghanistan and abandoned an entire nation to Islamic extremists. Biden became president, and Biden has a long record of avoiding any kind of resistance to foreign aggression. And so all of this was taken together, created a situation in which the Russian leadership, or Putin, may have felt that they had nothing to lose from attacking Ukraine and everything to gain, and that the resistance would be minimal. I mean, if we had had the sanctions that we have now in place after the annexation of Crimea, and Russia had been crippled economically at that time, and we don't know if it's going to be crippled now, but apparently it's going to be. That would have prevented what we now face.
Now, what I'm hearing very mixed reviews on the current set of sanctions. Some are saying that they are going to be crippling in the long run, although it's going to take time. Others
Some are saying, I'm sorry, that what?
Some are saying that this current set of sanctions will be crippling in the long run. Others disagree and say that they're barely scratching the surface. I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle, but it seems to me that the administration is still not willing to go full frontal, even on the sanctions front. And Secretary Blinken the other day articulated that depending on how negotiations go between Russia and Ukraine, some of the sanctions may be lifted. If the only thing stopping the lifting of the sanctions is the presence of Russian forces, does that mean that if they were to withdraw, all accountability for these horrific war crimes and violation of all norms be forgotten immediately?
Well, we don't know. We don't know what first of all, on the question of how effective are the sanctions, uh, um, uh, that's time will tell. Time will tell. Specialists have offered various opinions, and really, even they, of course, don't have absolute grasp of all the factors. So we'll see. But in any case, the sanctions that have been imposed, the sanctions that will be imposed in the future, should not be withdrawn under any circumstances until there's a complete Russian withdrawal from all occupied territory, including Crimea. Now, the thing that really needs to be done at this point, especially under conditions in which the US is very much afraid to become engaged militarily. I mean, we emphasize again and again that we will not have our troops in Ukraine. We will not institute a no-fly zone. I mean, those are all risky steps. They would be effective if we undertook them, I think. But I understand perfectly well that a government which is responsive to the wishes of the population doesn't want to go that far. But the one thing that we need to do is mobilize for total economic war. And that means cutting off all income to Russia from oil and gas. In other words, not just that Western Europe in particular has to stop importing energy from Russia. If they do that, then the US has to take steps to take up the slack and to help them overcome the economic crisis that will surely follow. And that means many changes in this country, including maximizing our energy output temporarily or for quite a while, rescinding or suspending environmental regulations, exploiting reserves. It's a massive change in orientation for the country, but it's necessary, and it's necessary in particular if we don't want to see American soldiers killed over there.
Well, now that you bring up the environmental regulations, according to John Rosamondo, who investigated the issue for Newsmax, as well as a number of European journalists, Putin was actually quite very much behind many of those regulations and pushed for the Green New Deal through various proxies and alliances with various groups in the United States, as well as on the Nord Stream. And apparently the original owner of Nord Stream had Stasi ties, and which linked him back to Putin's intelligence days. And all of that network of interest seems to have had a very significant impact on US domestic policy, which in turn has an impact on its foreign policy. How do you, the administration to this day refuses to admit that all these groups had any links to Russia, despite the fact that it's very obvious that a lot of it was fairly lucrative for a number of people. How do we get to that point that they're willing to set aside this profit motive from these alliances and these energy policies that benefit certain groups and turn to this obvious international interest of removing Russia from the equation?
Well, this is a job of, this is a political task. The Russians are making it easier with their atrocities, of course, and their aggression. The worst, if we don't know which way the war is going to go. So far, the Ukrainians have done very well, but the Russians do have weapons that they haven't used for the most part, and if they do use them, or if they carry out heinous massacres like what happened in Bucha, public opinion in the U.S. may support, with leadership, if we have leadership, it may well support drastic measures which will affect the economic welfare of every American, but which nonetheless would force Russia to cease and desist. Americans have to understand the full seriousness of what's happening. I don't think that that's been very well explained, but it can be, and it needs to be.
The explanations of consequences of different scenarios have been communicated very poorly indeed by various parties. But what the latest brouhaha has been about President Biden's comment that that Putin should not stay in office, and then various clarifications and counter clarifications and so forth, which of course Russia used to its own advantage in issuing political statements. But how do we get to the point where Putin is no longer a problem? Can we get to that point? Do you see a scenario of a regime collapsing, changing, evolving, or just being responsive to deterrence and changing its behavior? How do you see?
I mean, Putin would probably have to be removed, but there are people in the Russian military, in the Russian security establishment, who understand that this war is going to destroy Russia. It's going to destroy Russia even if they succeed in occupying Ukraine, because that means endless guerrilla war with the guerrillas supported by the West. I think that there are people in the Russian leadership who understand that this cannot bring anything good to Russia, and that the relationship with the West, including the economic and technological relationship, is necessary to Russia's future and the welfare of the people in Russia. I think there are people who understand that. And those are the people who hopefully will be able to either bring pressure to bear on Putin or possibly remove him altogether. That won't happen without decisive victories on the part of the Ukrainians and overwhelming economic pressure. Now, we're in a position in the U.S. to facilitate both of those results. Victory for the Ukrainians by providing them with everything that they need, and economic pressure by making sure that Russians cannot sell their oil and gas.
Well, that's an obstacle, because Russians are not, US is not, and Europe are not their sole clients. Russia is able to work with China, with Middle Eastern countries, none of whom have been responsive to that sort of pressure for fairly obvious reasons. US has not been responsive to their security concerns and has treated some of them with a great deal of disrespect on the highest level. how do we overcome this obstacle is another issue. I'm not sure that it's overcomable until we have a different administration in office. But Russia seems to be hedging its bets on trying to cause problems for the US through challenging the dollar, through working with these formerly close US Middle Eastern allies, and by partnering with China to cause other security implications. So we are seeing a far more complicated scenario with the Soviet Union. And in light of that, even in the best case scenario, Putin is compelled to change the course of action and temper his ambitions, or he's taken out. I'm not sure that the next step is going to be some sort of a liberal democratic order amenable to a real partnership with Europe and the US. For sure, not until all of those institutions are cleansed of these influences of since the Soviet Union. Do you see that happening?
Well, it's going to be a long time now. This is, you know, companies have left Russia. Will they go back? Can they go back? Time marches on. It's economic partnerships have been disrupted, and people will look for new economic relationships. I mean, the Russians are trying to establish some sort of new relationship with China. Chinese are not necessarily going to be anxious to choose Russia as a financial and business partner over Europe and the US. The consequences for Russia of these acts are likely to be, long-term and very serious. But the first objective, of course, is to stop the killing and stop the war and liquidate the consequences of Russia's aggression.
Now, that brings me to a slightly different point, which is since the fall of the Soviet Union, if it really fully fell ever, some might argue that it just evolved. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, there's been also a collapse of the Russia expertise, with many of the academics and other experts leaving for other fields or retiring and so forth. And there was never that drive. There was a big counterterrorism drive into the agencies and experts in Middle East, and then the next thing was China. But the lack of Russian, the handlers of Russia policy has been minimal. I don't hear of too many contemporary experts in the country speaking. Mostly, retired academics from at best, and even they are harder to come by. How do you think that field can evolve in response to current challenges? Do you think it needs to be? Can regular other specialists be repurposed? Do you think you need someone with specialized knowledge to be handling policies related to this? Is it something that's particularly important?
Well, the problem is that to understand Russia, you have to understand the Soviet Union. To understand the Soviet Union, you have to understand the Soviet ideology. To understand the Soviet ideology, you have to be very well educated and you have to have read in depth. And there are very few people who any longer who are willing to make that kind of commitment or even understand that that's what's necessary. This is the problem. So as a result, we may be producing Russia specialists of a sort, but we're not producing Russia specialists who actually can understand the country. Now, of course, if someone goes, and now it's easy, it used to be easier to go and spend time in Russia and live there. But once again, that's not a guarantee. That's a step in the right direction. But if you go there with your American stereotypes and without an in-depth understanding of what really is happening there, you can go away with a lot of misimpressions. This is a big problem for the US because Russia doesn't make itself easy to understand. and we want things that are easy. But nonetheless, when Russia does reach the point where their crimes are unmistakable, the U.S. has some capacity to react, and I'm hoping that even on that level, we can take the decisive actions that are necessary to bring Russian aggressivity and intimidation under control.
Right now, unfortunately, we seem to be there seems to be some level of public pressure on certain type of consequences, but at the same time, I'm not sure that the public wants to live with the consequences of those decisions. There is a complaint over even minimal sacrifices, whether economic or political, and there are also, by contrast, efforts to disguise other bad policies as if they're the consequences of this current endeavor. So it's becoming increasingly hard to separate what actually needs to be done from what has nothing to do with the situation, and it creates an impression for Americans that we are stuck in, that there's not much that we can really do without also harming ourselves.
That's probably, it's going to take sacrifice.
Mhm.
It's going to take sacrifice. And the point is to make Americans understand how important it is and the threat that Russia represents. That's what's necessary right now.
That's the big problem. I think at the core of the argument of how to deal with Russia in the future, not just Russia, but any long-term threat and any predicament, is whether Americans are willing to make sacrifices for whether they're willing to understand what those external threats mean for the US here and now, and whether there's anyone who can articulate those arguments in a way that people will want to support. Because right now, these populist tendencies on both sides of the aisle, I must add, do not really seem to be supportive of that position on any matter.
No, it's very true. I mean, the America has turned inward, and we are obsessed with things that are of not the greatest importance. But we can hope. We can hope for change, and I sincerely hope that under the impact of this crisis, there will be change in the U.S. In any case, I personally am trying to work for that.
Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you too. I'm very glad to be with you, and I wish you all the best.
To be hearing from you about your work in the future, and I think because of the sheer volume of your work, there'll be many relevant topics to discuss. This is just a response to the kind of lack of a strategic vision for this whole situation and a lack of context, really, for most people. All of this came out of nowhere. Yes, people have brought up Syria and Crimea, but those are fairly recent events, and only 2 or 3 out of a whole pattern of many other red flags that should have made us see what's coming. And of course, I look forward to discussing your new book once it comes out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for everyone tuning in today. We'll have the program next week at its usual time, 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With us today was David Satter, and as always, this is Irina Zuckerman, Editor-in-Chief. Thank you for watching, and have a great night.
Irina, can you send me a link to the broadcast when it comes out?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Well, all the best to you and take care. Glad to meet you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated this opportunity, and I look forward to reading a lot more of your work.
Thank you. Take care.
Have a good night.